Hi, it's Nicole, and today I'm going to be doing a book review on Marxism, a graphic guide, which I think is part of the Introducing ... series, which covers, I guess, lots of different philosophical ideas. The Marxism book is written by Rupert Woodfin and illustrated by Oscar Zarate. So I have a general interest in politics, and there are huge subjects like Marxism and capitalism and other things that affect a lot of the way that we see things, not just in the West, but globally. It just affects how we think about our relationship to the world and to others. And I'd like to generally have a better understanding of these kinds of keystone ideas, I suppose, in politics, and I feel like Marxism definitely is one of those things where it's a very wide-reaching idea that has affected the entire world in lots of different ways, and I feel like my understanding of it has been, until this point, very, very basic. To sum up the book, it's kind of a walk through the history and evolution of Marxism. It does touch on both communism and capitalism, but those are only kind of talked about to show different parts of Marxism's evolution. Marxism is an economic ideology, and that is used in communism. So I suppose going into it, I felt like it was probably going to be biased. That's something that I just assumed straight off the bat, and with anything dealing with political systems, I tend to kind of assume there will be some kind of bias to be aware of. And I feel like, yeah, that was true, but it wasn't nearly as much as I thought it was going to be. And I think that's in part because it was following the history and evolution of the ideology and not so much making a judgment on whether or not it was good or bad. And I felt like following the evolution through different people's praise and criticism of it was a really good way to keep things a bit more balanced. So obviously when talking about Marxism, there are a lot of themes around exploitation and the value of labor and what people should really be doing with their time. And I feel like a lot of those questions kind of changed, or the perspective on them changed as our relationship to work changes. And there are a lot of things that are definitely not relevant anymore, but there are some things that are definitely still relevant. I felt like this book, while it was really good for kind of leading you through the Marxist history, I suppose, it was very, very focused in Europe, and I understand why. Obviously that's the origins of Marxism, but I felt like when we have maybe a sentence mentioned of Asian countries that have flirted with or taken on completely this ideology into their politics and changed it in one way or another, I felt like it would have been really good to see more of that and how and why that was kind of adapted. There was a lot more looking at Russia, obviously, because in the West, I suppose the Soviet Union is the thing that we really think of immediately to do with Marxism. While China is a huge country that's based its politics somewhere in that ideology, it's a lot more distant from Europe and North America than the Soviet Union is. And I guess Europe and North America are the audience for this. But I felt like that was kind of a big oversight that I would have been really interested in knowing more about. So with things being Europe focused and Soviet Union focused, there was a lot of talk about Stalin and Lenin and Trotsky and what happened with the Russian Revolution, and I felt like I don't know enough about each of the personalities and each of their different takes on Marxism, and I still don't, even after reading this book, but I felt like Lenin was glazed over a bit much in a book that is talking about Marxism, and he is kind of one of those people that at least comes to my mind when I think about Marxism. Stalin was talked about the most out of those three, understandably, but I thought the way that it talked about these people made it kind of feel like not that Lenin wasn't bad, it's just I felt like it was very neutral towards him, and my understanding has been that he wasn't that great a guy. But that could be my bias that I'm not aware of. I don't know enough yet. And it could be something that I took from the book because the focus was on the bad guy-ness of Stalin, and then by comparison Lenin, who wasn't focused on as much, feels like really neutral somehow and just a bit carried away, and that's why things went a bit off for him, but it wasn't that he was necessarily that bad. Like, it felt like that to me, which I don't think is a fair representation of things. But again, I still don't know enough, so I need to do even more research on all of this to find out a clearer picture of things. There were times when I guess I was a bit impatient in my reading, and it would feel like it was veering off into a different direction, and then it would come around back to the point, and I would understand why it had done that. So, for example, the book goes into talking about postmodernism, and then comes back around to tell you why it's related to Marxism, and then later you can see how that is related to post-Marxism. And I did appreciate that, and I probably would have not felt so blindsided by it if I had actually read what was in the table of contents before starting the book, but I never do that, so my bad. Obviously, we can only see the evolution of Marxism by seeing the things that later Marxists would disagree with in Marx's original thinking. But I also appreciated that there was something in there from a capitalist perspective to kind of give a bit of balance, or to show a more modern opposition to Marx's ideas, and that opposition comes from Francis Fukuyama. I gather that he is a super important and popular capitalist thinker. I Wikipedia'd him quickly. Despite the historical overview that led this book, I still feel like I'm personally looking for something with a clearer perspective on what I kind of see as a false dichotomy between Marxism and capitalism. I have a lot of little questions that crop up for me, things along the lines of how fair is it to really make a comparison between those two systems when one of them has been tried in a lot more countries and in a lot more ways and for a lot longer time than the other. Capitalism being the one that's been tried in a lot more ways and by a lot more countries, whereas I feel like the examples that we tend to look at that have taken Marxism on board tend to have been adulterated versions of it, and this book kind of lightly touches on that. And I feel like a lot of the time when the argument between the two comes up, we don't also look at the flaws in capitalism that Marxism is sort of a reaction to. So I guess I was kind of expecting it to touch a bit more on those kinds of questions, but that wasn't really the focus of the book, and that's no fault of the book. It's just one of the expectations that I came to it with. As for the way that this was presented, because in the title it says that it's a graphic guide, I was expecting it to be more like a comic or a graphic non-fiction work kind of thing, and it felt more like a lot of paragraphs with illustrations in between that didn't necessarily feel like they were doing that much work. Like, I liked them, but it felt like a lot of the time it was just a loosely related image that didn't really help me to understand what was being said any more than just plain text would have done. And then in the illustrations there were speech bubbles of more text that did help me clarify what was said in the previous text, but it could have literally all just been text, and that would have been fine for me to understand what was being said. So I felt like the illustrations kind of ended up feeling a little bit like decoration, but on the other hand, I feel like that's almost inevitable when you're dealing with something that's as intangible as a political idea. So I guess the illustrations are kind of just decoration, but that is partly to make it feel like the content is more accessible and less scary feeling. And I did appreciate its function as that, but it did make me kind of feel like it wasn't super necessary. However, I really love the cover that my library had, so that's a thing. And I just want to say that mostly in this review, I'm working out my ideas and trying to synthesize what I've taken from the text. So I don't want to present it as though I'm being like really authoritative and explaining anything in any depth that this book wouldn't do way better than I am doing right now. And it's just kind of a reminder to me to not take for granted what you think you know about a subject. Because there were things that I thought I understood about Marxism that I realize now I didn't really have that clear an idea of, but when asked about it, I might have thought that I did. So I assumed going into this that it was probably going to be biased in one way or another, and for the most part I felt like it behaved itself pretty well and, you know, wasn't like crazy in favor or not, until the very end, where I felt like it made an odd decision to come down on one side, and it just kind of felt like, oh, you've just decided that for me, and I'm not really convinced of that position. So I much preferred the tone through the whole book, except for the last page, because it was more just looking at things that had happened. There might be a smidgen of bias here and there, but it didn't feel so clearly like, and now this is what you should think. So I really didn't like that part about it, but I'm willing to forgive that because I did learn a lot reading this book, and I also feel like there was a lot stuffed in there that I can now go and find out more about. There were a lot of sources, and there's also a glossary at the back that I think is super handy. Overall, I would say it was a really, really good introduction, because it gave you a lot of sources to work with for going somewhere else next. And also I thought that it did do a good job of presenting a basic timeline and giving you some basic concepts and a pretty solid idea of what these things are, even though I might not be very good at articulating what I took from it in this moment. So if you had no prior ideas about Marxism or politics in general or whatever, and you wanted to have a basic idea of Marxism, where it started, what it's gone through and why, where it sort of is now-ish, and an idea of key players in all of that and some of their main points, then I think this is a really, really good place to start. I found it a good starting place, and I have a lot of things that I want to cover next, and I felt like this was a good jumping off point for knowing where to go next. So yeah, I would absolutely recommend it, and of course, as always, I will also be reading other things around that, so hopefully I'll start to have a more rounded idea of these things and a more solid idea the more I read. If you have any ideas about where you would suggest someone going next if they want to look a little bit further into Marxism or socialism or capitalism or communism or anarchy or whatever, then absolutely leave that in the comments below because I'm here for it. And I will see you again next time. Bye! I've probably explained all of that really badly.